Welcome back, Matrix. I hope you've all had a chance to stretch your legs and grab a cup of coffee. We're carrying on with imperfect markets now. Right, same scenario as earlier on, 10 markers, 8 markers, and then the essay questions. Right, question 1, study the information below and answer the questions that follow. So there you've got a picture and it says battle to be the biggest bank in SA, and then they give us the logos of the various banks that we have. Give names of 2 banks from those above. We expect that you would know the logos of the banks. Standard Bank, we should all know, they support our cricket team, ABSA, our rugby, and then we also have Nedbank, and that one there is Capitec and FNB. So they want you to give 2 of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 being represented here, so you could give any 2 of the 5 would be accepted. Explain 2 characteristics that makes a banking sector an oligopoly. So you need to look at what are the characteristics of an oligopoly. You need to know those, and we only want you to explain 2 of them. So there you've got a list of the characteristics. The market is dominated by a few large businesses. Banks are interdependent. There's an element of collusion amongst banks, and they offer differentiated services. So you need to explain any 2, okay? So what we find is when we say they are interdependent, what does that mean? That means the actions of one affects their competitors. The market is dominated by a few large businesses, so we will find that the larger ones take the lead in terms of pricing, etc. There's an element of collusion amongst banks, meaning that they will do things which will benefit them more than it benefits the consumers. That's the whole thing behind collusion. And then they offer differentiated services, which means they all offer the same thing, but with some variances in place. Right, number 3, how do banks use non-price competition to make their products or service more price inelastic? Please remember what is meant. You see, to understand the question, you need to understand what it's asking. So non-price competition meaning we're not using price to compete with each other. And when we talk about price inelastic, we need to understand the concept of inelastic prices. Remember, if something is if the price for something is inelastic, it means it doesn't matter how the price shifts, the demand will still change irrespective, right? The demand remains the same irrespective of how the shift in price takes place. So they want to ensure price inelasticity, meaning people don't leave them for other businesses. So what they will do is extensive use of advertising to either provide information or just to remind consumers about what they have to offer and trying to persuade the consumers to come over to their side. Offers such as bonus points, online banking service, extended business hours, something that we see Capitec has been quite good at, in that's how they've managed to get quite a huge part of the market, is because of the hours that they are willing to keep, right? Number 2, study the graphs below and answer the questions that follow. Here they give us 2 graphs. Now immediately when I see this graph and I see that there's the AR curve, and so that would obviously then be MR, okay? So as soon as I see those 2 curves split like that, then I know here I'm talking about a monopoly. Because remember, in a perfect market, the demand curve was horizontal. And I know for an oligopoly, they have a kinked demand curve. So that's very, very, so this immediately tells me this is a monopoly. And then there they're just showing me the total revenue. And then the first question is which market structure? As I said, by looking at this graph, I know this is the graph of a monopoly. Or if you said imperfect market, that would also be an acceptable answer. And provide a suitable label for A. I said to you there's the AR curve, so that's the MR curve, right? That is which is characteristic to the graph within a monopoly market is that your AR curve and your MR curve are two separate curves, and the MR is always below the AR curve. Why is the demand curve equal to the average revenue curve? Right, if you think of how do we calculate average revenue, I said to you this earlier on. To get to average revenue, it is total revenue divided by the number of units that you have sold. So obviously whatever you've sold also constitutes your demand. Okay, so therefore we can see the demand curve shows quantity and price relations, which are therefore the same as quantity and average revenue relations. Using the information in the graphs, explain how the firm determines the price. Okay, so obviously they will determine their price where they can get the most, where they can possibly get it. Okay, so if you see here, they will look at their total revenue and obviously see where is total revenue at its peak or at its highest. And we see it's at that point where total revenue is at its highest. And if we take it up, then that's the point where they will set their price then. Okay? The average revenue from each, the firm fixes the price above the center of the demand curve, or AR curve. It is at this point that the total revenue increases. So at P2, total revenue decreases at Q2. So it is at P1 that the total revenue is at its highest. Okay? Which is there. Right. Moving on to question number 3, study the extract below and answer the questions that follow. Monopolistic competition. So it's giving us an idea what this is about. So monopolistic competition as a market structure was first identified in the 1930s by the economist Edward Chamberlain. Many small businesses operate under conditions of monopolistic competition, including independently owned and operated high street stores and restaurants. In the case of restaurants, each one offers something different and possesses an element of uniqueness, but all are essentially competing for the same customers. So the questions now, who was the first economist to identify monopolistic competition? It tells us in the piece, they said it's Edward Chamberlain. And give an example of a business operating in a monopolistic market. They tell you there, restaurants is an example, right? We also know that monopolistic competition, we also have our fast food outlets like your KFCs, your Burger Kings, all of those places as well could be an example. Briefly describe the hybrid structure as a feature of monopolistic competition. A hybrid means it's a combination of things. So your monopolistic competition is a combination of perfect competition and a monopoly, right? So that's the hybrid structure there. How can restaurants use different strategies to attract more customers? And this is not an answer you're going to get from a textbook. Obviously, you must think, what are the things that will attract you? Quick and better service, obviously. Clean and healthy environment, definitely. If it's a restaurant, I want to make sure it's clean and healthy. Consistent and good preparation of recipe. So there's a list given to you. You would only have to give 2 at least of the list. Right. Question 4, study the graph below and answer the questions that follow. You see, there they tell you it's a monopoly. AR, MR curves are separated once again. What is the selling price for the monopolist? Remember, what did we say? Where is your profit maximization point? Profit maximization point is where MC is equal to your MR. Okay? And there's my MR, there's my MC. So that is where we would want to produce. So I go from that point, I go up to the average revenue curve, and I go across, and I see there that is at 60 Rand or 60, okay? Does the equilibrium position above represent short or long run? It says here SMC, which stands for short run, short run ATC. So that's why I know it is the short run. Why will a monopolist always make economic profit in the long run? Well, he doesn't have any competitors, so he can manipulate the prices or the output to ensure his prices remain high, so therefore you will always be making a profit. Okay? What is the requirement for this monopoly to be classified as an artificial monopoly? If entry is restricted by factors such as legal requirement, which is licensing, patents, and copyrights. Okay? So if any of those things are in place, then it's an artificial monopoly, because by using copyrights and licensing, you are keeping others out of the market. Right, a natural monopoly is normally like Eskom, for example, would be an example of a natural monopoly. Calculate the total profit, right. So with the total profit, we said he'll be selling at 60, so it's 60 times 50, which is then 3,000, and the cost at that point, so I go to my average cost, and the cost is at about 30, it seems. So it's 30 times 50, which is 1,500. So my profit should be 1,500. Alternatively, you could say 60 minus 30 is 30 times 50, which will also be 1,500. Once again, the two ways in which the calculation can be made. Right, study the illustrations below and answer the questions that follow. Identify the products that are produced. They tell us there. A few companies dominate the cement industry. So we know that all of them are cement producers. Which market structure is depicted? Because there are only a few producers in the market. So this is an oligopoly. If it was only one, it would be a monopoly. If it was many, it would be monopolistic competition. Because you have to bear in mind your imperfect market have three different market structures, right? There's the monopoly with one supplier, oligopoly with a few suppliers, and the monopolistic competitor with many suppliers. Okay. So this is an oligopoly market. Why will a new business find it difficult to enter this type of market? The initial setup cost is high, which means that new entrants will have to sell at a higher cost than established businesses. Okay? Or there could be barriers to entry like licensing. Alternatively, companies already in the market will use branding to crowd out new competition. Okay, so what they're saying is to set up in this kind of market takes a lot of money. So you need to sell at a much higher cost to make up all that money that was spent. And advertising is also costly. Right, what does the interdependency of business in this market structure imply? Only a few sellers dominate the market. Therefore, each seller is influenced by the action of the other sellers. Explain without the use of a graph why businesses in this industry will be reluctant to decrease the price of their product. Okay? So, by decreasing the price, it might lead to a price war, which will drive prices down. So nobody makes money then at the end of the day. A decrease in price can also result in lower profits. And then due to the kinked nature of the demand curve, they will lose more revenue than they would gain via increased sales. I'm not going to explain this point now because this we will see later on when we do the 8 markers where you're asked to show this with a graph. Right, with the aid of graphs, discuss how economic profit and economic loss is determined in a monopoly market. Right, so here you can see the economic losses, how they, only the economic loss, not economic profit, sorry. Yeah, how economic loss is determined in a monopoly market. Very seldom that you have this situation because most of the time they will be making, like we said, they make profits in both the short and long run. But in order for a monopoly to achieve an economic loss, we have to ensure that that AC curve is above the AR curve, because wherever your AC is bigger than your AR, it means you're making a loss. Now, there you can see the maximum given for the graph is 6 marks, right? So you can 6 and only 2 points here will give you an 8 mark there. Okay, so once again, drawing the graph and then explaining exactly what you've just drawn. Okay, so we see there that is your selling price, which is at point G. Point F will represent the cost. So you can see your cost is above your revenue, so therefore you are making a loss. So that area there, they've given you 10 and 7. So you can also do the calculation. 10 times 5, which will give you 50 for your cost. 7 times 5 is 35 for your revenue, and total revenue minus total cost, which will then be 35 minus 50, means that your loss is 15 Rand. Okay? Alternatively, what you can say, 7 minus 10 is minus 3 times 15 minus 15. So that shows you've got a loss of 15 Rand. Distinguish between artificial and natural monopolies. Right, your natural monopoly, high development costs prevent others from entering the market, and therefore the government supplies the product. And the example here is Eskom. It costs billions of rands to build and maintain power stations, and therefore there are no other suppliers. A single business can serve the whole market at a lower price than 2 or more businesses together. Such a business is frequently owned or regulated by the government. Whereas your artificial monopolies, on the other hand, here the barriers to entry are not economic in nature. An example of a barrier is a patent. A patent is a legal and exclusive right to manufacture a product, example Denel. Land Systems Manufacturing, Caspers. Licensing is another way in which an artificial monopoly is applied. In South Africa, licenses are required for radios, TV broadcasters, etc. So therefore, licenses protects operators against entry of competitors. So as you can see, your barriers is what protects or keeps the monopoly going. Explain product differentiation in monopolistic competition. Once again, this is now one of the characteristics of the monopolistic competitor that you are asked to explain. So if you look at product differentiation, it has 3 dimensions. Products are not identical but are similar in many ways. The similarity between products lies in the fact that they satisfy the same consumer need. The example here they used is toothpaste. Differences may be imaginary as it is merely the service of the seller that differentiates its products from that of someone else. Example, medicine that contain the same basic ingredients. The packaging of a product may make it different from other or similar products. And the example used there is salt. Right, number 9. With the aim of a diagram, explain why oligopolists are reluctant to participate in price competition. Remember, we spoke about this earlier on, that you had to explain it without a graph. Because of the price wars, they are scared of that. So here we can see the kink demand curve within the oligopoly. So at 20 is where they would ideally want to be selling. Now you see what happens if this business decides to increase the price to 22 Rand, the quantity is going to drop to 8 Rand. So obviously he is earning more revenue, 22, or he thinks by selling for more he's going to earn more money. But if you look, 20 times 10 gives you 2,000. Whereas if you take 22 times 8, I did the calculation earlier, it's 176. So already, because what has dropped his revenue is because the quantity that he's selling is less. He's not selling 10 units at 22 Rand. So his revenue didn't go up to 220. It actually went down. So it's not worth his while to increase the price. look at what happens when he decides to decrease the price to 8 Rand. He manages to sell more, but only 1 unit more than what he was selling at, 20. So once again, his revenue is now 8 times 11, which is 88 Rand, which is still way less than the original 220 Rand he was earning. So as you can see, it is not in their interest to actually either increase or decrease their price. Because if you see here, the top part of the king curve, the demand is what we call elastic, meaning there's going to be huge changes in the demand when there's a change in price. Whereas the bottom part, the curve is relatively inelastic, means a change in price causes a very small shift in the demand. And if you see here, a huge drop in price from 20 Rand to 80 Rand only gave him an extra 1 unit to be sold, not the extra 100 units, as one would expect with such a big drop. Okay, so at the end of the day, the oligopolist is best suited to sell where the king is and remain there, okay? Because either way, he is not making more money. How does a cartel negatively affect businesses and consumers? Remember, I said a cartel exists when businesses come together, and like your oil-producing countries, okay? That's OPEC. When companies form cartels, market dominance is achieved and often maintained for lengthy periods, okay? So what happens is they keep the smaller or newer businesses out of the market. It makes it very difficult for them to get into the market, and even some of the firms need to exit the market. And so the cartel in itself becomes a barrier to the market. The consumers, on the other hand, they don't have access to a variety of goods and service, and also the cost is so much more, right? Because the price is being manipulated, and this could be harmful to the consumer. Right, the essay questions here. First question here is compare and contrast in detail the perfect competition and monopoly in terms of the following. Now, please remember, sorry, as I said, your imperfect competition, there is more than one market structure. So this particular question deals with perfect competition and the monopoly, but you could be asked to talk about perfect competition and the monopolistic competition, perfect competition and oligopoly. Any of those can be asked. But what I want you to note is that they ask you certain characteristics that need to be discussed, and it is accepted for you to answer within tabular form. So if you go and look in Mind the Gap, as well as within your core notes, there is a table given. So all you need to do in order to answer this kind of essay question is, if you know that table and you know it well, they can ask you any of those to be compared. And you can just call up the table and choose what information you need from that. The same thing with essay 2, it says discuss the characteristics of either market structure. What I mean here is they can ask you to discuss the characteristics of the monopoly, monopolistic competitor, or the oligopolist for 26 marks. Okay, remember, I'm only looking at the 26 marks here. Right, and then essay number 3. So when it comes to imperfect markets, these are the only sort of kinds of questions that can be asked in terms of an essay. Either discuss the characteristics or compare one of the imperfect markets with a perfect market. 10 markers, as I said, out of the box. Anything can be asked. But question 3 here deals not with perfect or imperfect markets, but this deals with market failure. Remember, I said I'm not doing market failures, but this question, I just thought I would throw in this essay because this is a very popular essay, not only as an essay, but also as 8 markers where you can be asked to discuss either minimum wages or maximum prices for 8 marks, and that is why I've decided to put this in here. So when we look at minimum wage and you look at the graph, when we talk about a minimum wage or even minimum price, what we need to bear in mind, it is always the level above the market equilibrium. So as you see here, the wage is, the equilibrium for wages is at W, but the minimum wage is set above this point by W1. So what does this mean when government enforces a minimum wage? Immediately that means that workers are going to be earning more money. And what do we see there? The supply of labor suddenly increases. Why? Because people are now willing to go and work for that amount of money. But we see a drop in the demand, meaning not as many people are being employed anymore, because employers are saying we can't afford to pay these high levels of wages. So what we notice is that, like I said, more people are willing to work, but employers are not willing to pay those high wages. So you see an increase in the supply of labor, but you see a decrease in the demand for labor. So what is the result? You're sitting with an oversupply at the end of the day. Okay. Right. When it comes to maximum prices now, we see maximum price, on the other hand, is below where the market equilibrium is. And what we need to bear in mind here is that the maximum price is set in order to benefit, once again, the consumer. Because if they allow the market forces to set the price, which will then be at level P, that means not everybody has access to these goods and services. So government wants more people to have access to it, so they implement a maximum price at P1, which is below the equilibrium point. So what happens now is we see an increase in the quantity demanded, but we see a decrease in the quantity supplied. So thereby a shortage is being created on the market. And obviously the result of shortages is that it could lead to black market. And a black market is none other than an illegal market where illegal prices are being charged for goods. Okay. Right. That brings me to the end of the imperfect market. And now I would like us to have a look at multiple choice questions which can be asked on the markets. And I find with these, you just get a better understanding of the concepts, right? So question number 1 here, the diagram shows the market for a good. The equilibrium is at point X, and the government fixes a minimum price for the good at P2, okay? What will happen to the market as a result? What we find is that nothing else changes, everything remains the same, so therefore the quantity demanded will rise, the quantity supply will fall, there will be an excess supply. So what would be the result here? We find that that is where the market equilibrium will remain the same, right? That's not going to change because neither supply, the total supply, total demand hasn't changed. It is the quantity only that has changed. So it causes a shift along the curve, but not a shift of the curve. Right, number 2, what is found in a competitive market? Every firm earns large profits. Firms with limited capital can enter. The costs of production are always lower than a monopoly. There is limited choice for consumers. Now, as you can see, that one is entirely out of the box because in a competitive market, there are lots of sellers. So this one is definitely not true. We also find that C, the costs of production are not always lower. And firms do not always they earn profits, but not large profits, okay? So therefore, the only answer you can give here is B, which is firms with limited capital can enter the market. Right, a firm that sells, number 3, a firm that sells its product for 6 Rand a unit has the following total costs. So it's 40, 100, so 0 units, 40, 10 cost is 100, 20 units is 120, 30, 150. Okay, so which statement is correct? Average cost is at its lowest when 10 units are produced. Now remember, it is the total divided by the average. So then it's 10 Rand, 120 divided by 20 gives you 6. 150 divided by 30 gives you 5. So we see go 10, 6, 5. So that is definitely not right because the average cost is much lower at 30 than it is at 10. The firm does not make any profit when 20 units are sold. Remember, it's being sold for 6 Rand a unit. So 20 times 6 is 120. And my total cost is 120. So 120 minus 120 is 0. So the firm does not make any profit when 20 units are sold. Yes, that is correct. It says here the firm has no fixed costs. Obviously, firms have fixed costs, total variable costs. Okay, right. So the only correct answer here is B. The firm does not make any profit when 20 units are sold. Which statement about fixed costs is correct? They exist only in the long run. Untrue. They include raw material and direct labor costs. No. Raw material would not be a fixed cost. They increase at the same rate as output. No, they do not vary according to output at all. They must be paid even if there is no output. Yes, that one is true, right? So remember I said earlier, whether you produce 0 units or 100 units, you still have to pay your rent. You can't not pay that. Number 5, what is an external benefit when a charge is made for vehicles entering a city centre? This comes from market failures where we deal with externalities. So what is the external benefit? Increased government revenue? No. For vehicles entering, increased traffic? That's not a benefit. Reduced air pollution? Yes. Definitely. And reduce business activity. No, that won't happen. Right. But definitely, when you're charging vehicles for entering the city centre, we will see less traffic, not increased traffic. But there will, so because there's less traffic, there's reduced air pollution. Number 6, Cadbury Schweppes, the confectionery business, is reported to want to reduce the number of its offices in an attempt to decrease its general and administrative costs. Which type of cost does Cadbury Schweppes hope to decrease? Right. So if you look at here, what are the costs they're talking about? Average variable, marginal, total fixed, and total variable. So if you look at what are the costs they're wanting to decrease, general and admin costs. So that's got nothing to do with variable, nothing to do with marginal. So the only answer you can get here is the total fixed costs. Prices tend to be lower in a competitive industry than in a monopoly. Why is this? A monopoly has less influence on the market. Untrue, it is the market. Competitive industry has more economies of scale. No, they have less. New firms are free to enter the competitive industry. Yes, that's true. And profits are lower in a monopoly. That's not true. So the only answer is C. Okay? Once again, we've got a table showing the cost and it's selling for 6 Rand again. How many units will the firm, you see, same kind of table, but a different question. How many units will the firm produce to maximize profits? Okay, so let's go see. 3 times 6 is 18. 18 minus 12 is 6. 4 times 6 is 24. 24 minus 15 is 9. 5 times 6 is 30. 30 minus 20 is 10. 6 times 6 is 36. 36 minus 27 is 9. So where did I get the biggest answer? At 5 units, because there my profit was 10. So the only answer there would be C. Okay? The graph shows the demand and supply curves for an industry, right? What would cause a shift in supply curve from S1 to S2? Please, guys, be very careful when seeing questions like this, because originally when I looked at this graph, I got a completely different answer, and then I looked more closely. It moved from S1 to S2, which means there was a decrease in supply, okay? So an increase in the number of firms in the industry is not going to cause a decrease. An increase in the number of workers employed is not going to cause a decrease. An increase in the productivity is not going to cause a decrease. An increase in the wage rates paid to workers. Why would that cause? That's the only answer there. Why would that cause a decrease? Because remember, increase in wage rates leads to a decrease in the demand for workers. So people will rather then let go some workers, and therefore the supply then also decreases. Right, the last question here, question 10. The perfect competitor must be able to cover its wage costs to prevent shutdown. And it's so strange, most of the people says average variable. No. To prevent, remember, when they reach this AVC is equal to MC, that's when they will shut down. But we want to prevent shutdown. So in order to prevent shutdown, they must be able to cover at least their fixed costs. Okay. And that's all I've prepared for you for today, grade 12s. I hope that you have learned some exam techniques from today's session, and market failures we will do at a later stage still, but I hope that this has helped you get a better understanding of at least the perfect and the imperfect markets, and most importantly, the graphs specifically. Thank you.